We're now moving to what is probably one of the most interesting parts of the course, especially in terms of theory, because here we're going to be looking at the way that the property economist as a valuer operates at the intersection between economic theory and practical economic reality. Here we're going to be looking at the question of market theory and how it contributes to the question of property price. And then we're going to be looking a little bit at location theory to see exactly how rents do come about. We introduced this idea briefly in our first module, but here we're going to take it considerably deeper. Most people have seen already the market diagram that stands at the very base of the whole enterprise of economic theory. The crisscross of supply and demand is familiar to most people. It turns out that market pricing by supply and demand only returns the economic benefits that are attributed to it when you have a special market condition known as the perfect market. And in the perfect market, you require several things, including a large number of buyers and sellers, perfect knowledge by all parties, perfect mobility, which is a technical term to say that people can move in and out of the market without compulsion, without undue need, at will. And so you can't have a perfect market in the necessities of life, for instance, but you can have a perfect market in bottles of wine, perhaps. For the perfect market, you also need to have a situation where you can't have substitution. And by substitution, we mean a bottle of wine might be exchanged maybe for a bottle of soft drink or something else, which has similar benefits to the user. In the perfect market, there are no transaction costs and no information costs, and all of the parties are able to bid competitively whenever they go into the market, something like what you find in an Asian bazaar. If you have these conditions, this theoretical supply and demand interacting in an environment of perfect mobility and perfect knowledge, the price that the market will settle to is considered to be the perfect market price, which has certain advantages for the community. In particular, it's considered that this price will bid prices down to the normal cost of production. And you'll notice here on this diagram we have a line here, not just for supply and demand, but also for the normal cost of production, what's listed here as the actual normal costs. The actual normal costs include a fair profit for the producer. And so to maybe make a bottle of wine, this would include the costs of growing the grapes and doing all of the winemaking things, including putting the bottles on and so on, and a reasonable income for the owner and operator of the vineyard. And so normal costs are those costs which would bring something to market and enable your business to run comfortably along. Let's look at how that operates in practice. First of all, you don't need a perfect market for the market to clear. Clearing markets means that as many things are bought from the market as are brought to the market, and so supply equals demand. A lot of people think that the perfect market is one where at the end of the day there are a right number of goods and nobody goes wanting. That's not quite the case. So we will have clearing markets even with an imperfect market situation. An imperfect market situation is one where there's an economic rent. An economic rent is where there's a gap between the normal cost of production and the actual price. And that means that the supplier is able to charge a price beyond what they need to charge in order to earn a reasonable profit. In other words, to run their business, feed their family, and the other things which they're in business for. These economic rents are attractive because they make individuals more wealthy. But on the other hand, when you look at it overall as an economy, economic rent introduces various inefficiencies, and we cover those in the study guide. Overall, the process of market competition is intended to help compete the price lower and lower as supply and demand become better informed and better experienced, until the price eventually is competed down to the perfect market price, which you can see here has settled at the normal cost of production. The other interesting thing about the normal cost of production curve is that that's pretty much where supply and demand settle. In a perfect market, people will understand that it's impractical to have someone run a business, maybe supplying bottles of wine, for a price less than the normal cost of production, because they'll go out of business, or it just won't be worth their while running that business. They'll be running it like a charity when they're really intending to feed their family. And so the supply curve doesn't exist below the normal cost of supply. Likewise, an informed and reasonable person going out to buy a product will understand that in a commercial environment things won't be produced there, and so the demand curve doesn't really exist below the normal cost of production either. Now, there's an interesting thing about the normal cost of supply, and that is normal cost of supply has to do with the cost of supply. When we look at land, we find that the fundamental stuff of land actually comes free. We simply find it and we define it, put it onto a title register somewhere, and then we own it and then buy and sell it between ourselves. It actually comes at zero cost. And this is curious, because what it means is if there is a zero cost of production, then the perfect market price for such a good, in this case land, will also be zero. And so the perfect market cannot actually price land, which is one of the curiosities which kind of slips through the gaps in a way in most economics texts, because by and large economics textbooks are focused on products, those things that require a certain amount of labour input and other complex inputs such as capital and so on in order to come to market. Land doesn't do that. In the last couple of modules, if you go back and have a bit of a think about them, you'll notice that the way that subdivision land is priced is not done on the basis of the cost of supply of the land. You remember we're looking at land that was only worth in the vicinity of $1 or $2 before it got developed. But when it goes to be sold to the developer, it acquires a price considerably higher than its cost of supply. So this produces a problem for the property valuer. We can't use the normal economic concepts of supply and demand. So we move to the question of what sets the rent. To answer that question, we're going to start off by just going through a very simple example. For instance, how about if you decide to work for yourself and you consider that working for yourself with the risks and difficulties of being self-employed, you'll do that if you're able to earn an income, let's say, of $150,000 a year. And let's say that you notice a business opportunity as a fast food shop where you have projected sales of $500,000 a year. To get that $500,000 a year, you're going to infer costs. That's your rent, cost of materials, all the rest of it, of about $300,000. From this very simple situation, can we work out what a reasonable rent on that shop would be? Now, hopefully, the last couple of modules on development should be fresh in your mind, and you'll know that the developer equation can be actually pushed into service to answer this question. We simply subtract from the revenues the costs, which include the normal cost of the entrepreneur operating the shop, and what we find is that the answer is fairly available to us. It's about $50,000. Next question is that what happens if we see a better location, a shop perhaps closer to more people or what have you, and the projected sales are now $600,000 a year, and maybe your costs have gone up to $320,000. Again, we ask the question, what's the rent? I'm not going to answer it at this point. I'd like you to put that perhaps on the discussion board once you've finished going through this module. It's not as difficult as perhaps it might look. What we see here is that the difference in rent has to do with the difference in their productivity or the difference in their profitability. And when we make that observation, which you'll find littered around through Whipple, what we're actually doing is restating a law which was first enunciated very close to 200 years ago by a gentleman by the name of David Ricardo, who was an English political economist, or an economist in today's language. And that's known as Ricardos Law of Rent. We're going to be dealing with Ricardos Law of Rent in a separate module, and so we won't go any further in it in this module. What we want to do, though, now is move on to saying, well, if the market can't give us a price for land, what does? We've already seen that we can work out or deduce a rent in this little example that we've done. But how about the way that land gets its value in different parts of towns? By the way, what we're talking about here with towns, you can also apply to rural land. The theory that we're using here owes its origin to a gentleman by the name of William Alonso, who was a professor not so terribly long ago in the 1960s. He gave us what's known now as Alonso's bid rent theory. He was actually developing a rural theory which looks very, very similar. However, I'll let you search that out in your own time. Here we'll just look at Alonso's theory. We often, or we can observe fairly easily, that in most towns and cities, the most valuable real estate is right in the very centre, what we call the CBD, the Central Business District. There, the rents paid are the highest usually in the urban area, in the city or the town. But the land use in that area, in that CBD, falls off in attractiveness to its users once you get away from more or less walking distance from the heart. And that's the same whether you're talking about a minor country town or a major capital city. The centre of the CBD is defined pretty much by walking distance. And what that means is there's a fairly rapid fall off in the willingness of tenants to pay rent once you get outside walking distance. So I'd say that the rent curve for the most valuable land, the CBD land, has a very steep gradient, which is basically determined by, as I say, by walking distance. And for those of you who have worked in the centre of a major CBD, you'll know this walking distance limit is very, very active. It's one of the reasons why we use lifts in capital cities a lot, whereas in suburban areas we're more likely to do a bit more walking. As we move away from the centre, we find that there's a secondary ring of land use which is a bit more tolerant to distance. Alonso in this example is suggesting this will be office. In fact, the office use is segmented. You've got the high value office users who use the very core of the CBD, say for Sydney or one of the other capital cities. They will be financial organisations, the head offices of insurance companies, banks, stock exchanges, that sort of thing. As you move out to the fringes of the CBD, you find other offices, and they have a different profile of willingness to pay rent. And so you have at least a couple of rent gradients depending on the type of office. And as we move further away from the centre, we get to the residential fringe, because the residential land user is not able to pay the kind of rents, by and large, that office users are. And so you end up with that shallower rent curve. Overall, that gives you a gradient of rent, which is done by basically connecting the dots, connecting the top edge of this profile, and it gives you this curve of diminishing rents as you move out from the centre. This is Alonso's bid rent curve. We'll be going into that in more detail in other courses. Overall, that's pretty much what we cover in this module. We'll also be giving you a couple of field activities to reflect on this. It's very practical, and unfortunately it can be a bit of a shock if you're really enamoured of conventional economic theory to suddenly discover that you're going to become a specialist in a type of product, a type of good, which is traded on a market. It's very, very important, but actually doesn't fit the market model.